Is Black Myth Wukong everything is hyped up to be? And for all the trophy hunters out there, should you aim for that platinum? In this video, I'll dive into my gameplay experience and share my review to answer these questions, so let's get into it. Black Myth Wukong is an action role-playing game developed and published by Game Science. It's inspired by the classic Chinese novel Journey to the West. The game has received generally favourable reviews from the critics. It sold an impressive 10 million units within the first 3 days of release, making it one of the fastest selling games of all time, second only to GTA 5 at the time of this recording. The game features a linear story divided into 6 chapters, each set in unique and expansive areas. Players take on the role of the Destined One, a character designed after Sun Wukong from the novel, as they navigate through the game's rich world. The game has a total of 36 trophies and has an estimated time of 40 to 60 hours to platinum. There are 7 missable trophies in the game with a number of steps to complete them, but you will be able to go back and explore the game at the end. There is also a requirement to play most of New Game Plus, so the missable trophies can be cleaned up on the second playthrough. The trophies can be broken down into the following. There are 8 story trophies, which are mostly tied to beating a boss at the end of the chapter. There are 14 miscellaneous trophies, which are for performing certain actions such as unlocking a skill or for beating a specific optional bosses. Then finally, there are 13 collectible trophies. This is what most of the missable trophies is linked to, and it is mainly to do with a handful of collectible items and not all of them. Now I'll go over my experience playing the game. If you'd like to avoid spoilers and jump straight to my review, you can skip ahead to the time shown on screen or use the timestamp in the description. And if you're enjoying the video so far, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. You start the game as Sun Wukong flying into battle, and I got my first taste of the combat and some of the mechanics that are in the game. The core gameplay controls are simple to understand at the start of the game. You have a light attack, a heavy attack, and instead of parrying, you dodge, which based on your timing depends on it being a normal dodge or a perfect dodge. Although the controls for combat are simple to understand, it takes a little bit more to get the timing for when you should do something as opposed to how you do it. After the intro fight is finished, you are then shown the character you'll be playing for the rest of the game just before starting chapter 1. With the main game started, I decided rather than just rushing through the game to get to the end, I would explore each area as much as possible to find as much as I could and hopefully reduce the amount of cleanup that would be required at the end of the game. So I slowly made my way through the game and in no time at all encountered my first of many bosses that are available to fight and really start to get a feel for the controls in the game and already get hooked. Everyone who plays the game will experience boss fights differently as with most games. It didn't take long to beat the first boss and to be able to progress further into the level while still trying to explore as much as possible, collecting any items I came across and interacting with anything that prompted for it. It wouldn't be long before I would get the second resting point in the game where I would find the first boss that would prove to be a challenge to beat, the Wandering Wight. And I was not alone in my struggle with this boss. Many players were saying that it was a difficult fight and it took them multiple tries before beating him. The fight was, however, purely optional if I was not going for the platinum. I made my way through the rest of the chapter and there were 3 more mandatory bosses before I would have to fight the final boss. The first 2 I was able to beat with very little issue. I made mistakes in the first encounters with them, but I was able to correct them and win the next time round. The next boss I had a little bit of an issue with was the White-Haired Noble. And my main issue was I was getting caught by a lot of his attacks, which meant I was using all of my heals up very early into the second phase of the fight, and then unable to last to the end, but after slowly learning his attacks, I slowly improved and eventually was able to defeat him. Now, there was only 1 boss left for the end of the chapter, but before I went to fight him, I did a little bit more exploring and found the secret area of the chapter, which held an optional boss which I was able to beat with no issue, and my reward for beating this boss was an item called a vessel, which would prove to be very useful against the final boss. The final boss of chapter 1 had 2 phases, but unlike other games where it would go straight into the second phase, they are split into 2 different arenas. So after fighting him in a cave and beating him, he would tell you to meet him at the next area, which would begin phase 2. Once I had made it to the second area, phase 2 of the boss fight began, and this is now where the vessel from the secret area boss would come in handy, as once it had been activated, it reduced flame damage, which is what this boss eventually starts to use. So finding the vessel and using it turned what might have been a very challenging fight with the amount of fire left in the arena to a very easy fight to help finish out the chapter. With chapter 1 finished, it was now on to chapter 2, which takes place in a completely new area of the game. And this is the same for each new chapter in the game. You will always be in a new area. So now it was back to exploring and collecting everything I found and beating any and all bosses I come across. The most important item I was able to collect in the chapter was again from a secret area, and it was indeed another vessel. But it was by accident I would realise how useful this vessel was. Once I was happy I had explored all I could, I went to fight the final boss of the area. I didn't find the fight too challenging because even though I didn't beat him in the first encounter, I could see what I was doing wrong and correct it. But what did end up making the fight easier is that by chance I decided to activate the new vessel when the boss had entered his second phase and had us fighting inside a sandstorm. But by activating the vessel I had found in the chapter, it stopped the sandstorm and instantly made the fight so much easier. And with that, I beat the final boss of chapter 2 and progressed into the next chapter. Chapter 3, in my experience, is the longest chapter in the game. And at the start, there isn't very much to explore. But as you go further into the area, it starts to open up and then there's a lot more to explore. There was one section of chapter 3 that really frustrated me, and that was the prison. I can't remember how many times I died in the area, but it was too many. The main cause was because of these creatures that activate a frenzy, which reduces your health while making enemies hit harder. So I tried to kill them, but I would either die because I couldn't survive with a low health, or be thrown off the edge by them. So I decided to run through the area, which worked a lot better for me. I made it to the top of the prison to fight the boss and then move on to continue exploring the chapter. After leaving the prison, I slowly made my way through the rest of chapter 3 and made it to the temple, which was the last section of the chapter. So after exploring the temple, I made my way to the final boss. This boss had 3 phases. The first 2 weren't too difficult, and once you beat one phase, if you did die, you would go straight back to the phase you died on. And this is the same with all boss fights, which does make the game easier in that sense. The part I had a few issues with was the last phase, and this was because whenever I tried to use the freeze ability on him, he would stop it, so I had to just beat him with no abilities, and after a good few attempts, I eventually defeated the boss and could move on to the 4th chapter. Chapter 4 is where I felt I did my best exploring, because I found a lot. I found all the shrines, all of the enemies I had to fight, and most of the collectibles in the chapter. But even with all that, I would later find out I locked myself out of some things that would need to be collected in New Game Plus. This wasn't a difficult area to go through, but there was one boss that gave me some trouble, and this was the last of the 4 long dragon bosses, which are completely optional, and I was fighting this one for a good while. And even using everything at my disposal, I was still losing. I was getting to the point of thinking that this was going to be it. This would be the platinum killer. But I pushed through and eventually was able to win the fight and get a good few items from him as a reward as well. The best one is a spell which allowed you to transform into the boss when you were in a fight for a short duration of time. I then continued exploring and eventually found the secret area of the chapter. So I worked my way through it and beat the boss there and was rewarded with the 3rd vessel, and again this would prove to be very useful in the final boss fight of the chapter. So now all the chapter was explored, I made my way to fight the final boss, and this fight starts with other characters helping you at the start, before being left on your own to beat him. But if you do die in the first encounter, when you return, the portion of health that they take off is how much the boss's health starts off at. The attacks were not too difficult to learn, and after a couple of attempts I would get him to his next phase. Now, in this phase, he was taking reduced damage and hitting harder. The boss seemed to be relentless, but I decided, based off the fact that the previous chapters I earned the vessels in had helped with the bosses, to try the new one I had collected in this fight, and it made a massive difference. As soon as I used it, it took the boss out of the new phase and knocked him over. It then wasn't long before I defeated him and moved to chapter 5. The end of the story was now in sight, so I made the decision to not do as much exploring in this chapter so that I could make it to the end of the game and start the cleanup so much sooner. So with that in mind, I made my way through the chapter, fighting a number of bosses. The main ones to note are the carts, as I needed to beat 5 of them to unlock the secret area of the game, to fight the boss that needs to be beaten in both playthroughs. This is to ensure you have all the materials to craft an armor set you unlock from beating him. The secret area boss wasn't an easy fight. He was all over the place, so keeping up with him wasn't easy at all. and he could do some serious damage as well. But using the fire vessel collected from chapter 1 and slowly learning his attack patterns, I was eventually able to beat him and start making my way to the final boss of chapter 5. In this boss fight, I was doing very well in the first encounter and holding my own with no problems for a while. I beat the first phase first time, but the second phase I wouldn't have the same luck. I was very close to having a first time win, but at the end of the fight I made a few silly mistakes and was beaten. But I did go back in a few more times and eventually defeated them and moved on to the final chapter of the game, chapter 6. So I was now on the final chapter for the story of the game and only a few things left to do. The first was to beat the first boss of the area. The fight wasn't too bad, it only took me 2 attempts to beat him, and once beaten you unlock the ability to fly around the last area on a cloud using Sun Wukong's cloud somersault ability, or as I like to refer to it, Nimbus from Dragon Ball. And this is needed to explore the area as chapter 6 doesn't have as much to do in it, but it is a large area to explore. The next step in chapter 6 is to beat 4 bosses to collect Sun Wukong's armor and then be able to go and collect his staff. The first 2 bosses I found weren't too bad. I fought an armoured rhino and worked out that if I broke his horn I did a large chunk of damage, and with that I was able to beat him very quickly and was rewarded with one of the 4 armour pieces. The next boss I fought was a deer, which again was not too difficult. I managed to beat them on the first attempt by being careful and not just rushing in and attacking constantly. Once I had beaten the deer, I was awarded my second armour piece. After beating the deer, I was really lost. I didn't know what I was supposed to do next, but there was a big bug jumping around the area and I couldn't work out what I was supposed to do with it. Luckily, one of my friends explained what I needed to do, and that was to land on its back and then grab onto its antenna. This would be a test of the character's stamina and then later a test of health. The stamina had passed no problems, but I could not for the life of me pass the health test. We compared my stats to my friends and I was higher in health. I even went back to some of the levels to get some more upgrades for my health, and that still didn't work. I just kept on dying until he suggested I put on the fire vessel. That was the only difference he could remember, which as soon as that was equipped, I passed the health test with ease and was awarded the 3rd piece of the armour. Now I had one more boss fight left to get the last of the armour, and this would be fought in a unique area which was inside a character's stomach. The boss was a praying mantis, which you were shrunk down to fight it. This again was not a difficult fight and didn't take me long to defeat the boss and be awarded the final armour piece I needed, and with that I went to collect the staff and made my way to the final boss of chapter 6 and the final boss of the game. So I was finally at the last boss of the game. This was the hardest boss I had to fight yet, but also one of my favourites, even if it was frustrating. The boss fight starts with you fighting the stone monkey, and this was not too bad. I did vent my frustrations on my first attempt while on stream because he summoned a second version of himself, which I just thought was unfair. But on my second attempt I'd beaten the boss and was just left a bit underwhelmed and thinking, is this it? That thought was very short-lived when the cinematic of the stone monkey changing started and the true Sun Wukong appeared. This is where the fight was taken up a notch, as he now had access to all the skills and abilities I had access to. The major difference though was where I was limited to using one of a set of skills. For example, I was only able to use Immobilize or Ring of Fire, whereas he could use both. So he could use any skill at any time, and I definitely complained about that during the fight. But complaining wasn't going to help me win, so I just had to focus and get it done. I was very close to achieving victory in my first attempt, but that wouldn't be the case. Too many mistakes at the end and nerves got the best of me and I was beaten. But I didn't give in, I kept going back for more, and it wasn't too long before I would emerge victorious and roll the credits for the game. But I wasn't done yet. I had plenty left to do before the Platinum Trophy would be mine. So I went through all my gear and items and compiled a list of what I needed to collect and started to chip away at them. Most of them weren't too bad, but the worst item type of all to collect was the seeds, and this is due to the combination of RNG for the collectible and then the fact that the plants you collect from only respawn after a minimum of 30 minutes in real world time has passed, which makes the grind a little bit more annoying. Luckily, I was working on this while going through all the other collectible items and managed to get all of the RNG collectibles from the plant while doing this, so wasn't wasting time just standing around waiting. Once I had collected all the collectibles I could in this playthrough and worked out what I had left to do when going into New Game Plus, I had one thing left to do, and this was to unlock the secret ending, which I had already completed the unlock requirements to go for it, which were to finish all the other 4 secret areas in chapters 1, 2, 4 and 5. Now, until this point, I'd thought the Wukong boss fight was hard. This was so much worse. I constantly struggled to learn the timings of his attacks and would fail at different times of the fight every attempt. And after a while I could get him close to defeat but just couldn't finish him. So I did something I really didn't want to have to do through the entire game, and that was to use a potion that would allow me to be resurrected upon death with full health. The effect of the potion was timed, so I left it till I had got his health down really low and had no heals remaining before I used it, and it proved to be the right choice as he did kill me when I was close to victory again. However, this time I was resurrected and able to defeat him myself. The fight then moves into the next phase, which sees you transform into a giant stone monkey. This section of the fight, however, was really easy, and you could regularly heal yourself by using the focus points you build up through the fight. It didn't take me long to secure the win and complete the secret ending of the game. So now I would go back to beat the final boss again, as I didn't know if this was needed or not to carry everything over I collected to New Game Plus. So I wanted to be safe rather than sorry. I then ran my way through the chapters in no time at all, collecting all the missable and New Game Plus only items I needed, quickly making my way through chapters 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 until all I had left to do was go back to a broken cart in chapter 5 after finishing the chapter to speak with a horse that was trapped inside, and in doing so this would grant me the last 2 trophies I needed and finally the platinum. So, was Wukong everything it was hyped up to be? I would say yes, and then some. The game is brilliant and I really enjoyed my time playing it. The combat was fun, I enjoyed the dodge system that they implemented, and having recently played Wulong, it was similar to their dodge parry mechanic, so I didn't find it too difficult to pick up. The other part that I thought was really impressive is the quality of the cinematics in the game. They are really good, and I especially like the cinematics from the last boss fight, and one scene in particular, which I just had to screenshot for a wallpaper. The main drawback for me though is that there were 1 or 2 boss fights that the camera angles were not the best, but part of me thinks that I may be partially to blame, and that is because I would only have an issue if I got stuck in a corner, and I only ever got trapped in a corner when I rushed in when I shouldn't have. Now on to the important question: should you platinum Black Myth Wukong? As of the making of this video, I would actually say no. And this is partially because of all the missable trophies in the game, which can be easily missed due to progressing a little bit too far and locking yourself out of content until New Game Plus. And the other part is the number of collectibles that rely on RNG too much. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't play this game, this is definitely worth a playthrough, but I would just not recommend the platinum. Now, I know me saying not to go for the platinum won't change most trophy hunters' minds, so with that I would say if you do still want to go for the platinum in the game, I would recommend waiting just a little bit until guides online have been fully fleshed out and a complete path to the platinum has been worked out. For those of you still watching, I just want to say thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the video. And if you did, and you want to see more content from me, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. And also, if you do have any game suggestions you think I should go for the platinum in, let me know in the comments below.